dear Professor George, and distinguished guests. The organizers promised that this event will change everything you have ever thought about the topic that we will be discussing. To be honest, I at least hope that that's not true. Instead, I believe that you will experience tonight a clear, intellectually honest, elaborate, and well-delivered lecture and discussion on a topic that divides Slovak society. It would not have crossed anyone's mind to discuss this topic 100 years ago. The fact that we are discussing it today is for some a sign of progress, for others a sign of regress. Be it as it may, this topic will not go away soon, and perhaps our thinking and acting on this issue today may influence what the speakers will talk about at the Bratislava Hanus Days 100 years from now. The challenge for someone introducing a personality such as Professor Robbie George is that we would have to spend the whole evening if I wanted to give you a comprehensive account of the vast sea of achievements, awards, books, articles, and institutions connected to Professor George. Suffice it to say that the New York Times once described him as the most influential conservative Christian thinker in the United States. And let me highlight just a few connections between Professor George and Slovakia. Although this is his first time visit to our country in person, his writings and ideas have been at work here for at least the last 20 years, as far as I know. I first learned about Professor George when I was a student at Oxford. It was then that I and Juraj Šust, and later many of our students of the Collegium of Anton Neuwirth, started attending first principles seminars and other summer schools at the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. It is this institute that Professor George founded and where he now serves as the Herbert Vaughan, I don't know how to pronounce that, senior fellow. I don't think I've ever thanked him, really, for these great educational opportunities that both I and many of our students benefited from. So let me take this opportunity and thank you, Professor George. It really was a memorable time for me to spend those 2 weeks at Princeton back in the day, and I know that that's true for many of our students. Moreover, his article, What Sex Can Be, and his book, What is Marriage, has been a stable part of the Collegium Moral and Political Philosophy courses for many years. The Collegium of Anton Neuwirth translated the book, What is Marriage, to Slovak in 2013, this is the book, and sold about 1,000 copies in less than 2 years, which makes it still one of our bestsellers. The book was published before the Slovak referendum on marriage, but unfortunately, its arguments did not inform the public debate as quickly and firmly as we had hoped. It is unfortunate because I think and believe the arguments developed in this book are still the best rational arguments against legislating same-sex marriage. It is a great privilege that we can spend the next 90 minutes discussing these arguments with someone who has thought about them in the greater context of moral and political philosophy for years. And he has not worked on them alone, but together with many of his colleagues and friends who have been developing a sound and long-standing natural law tradition of ethics on many hot topics of today. I look forward to the lecture and to the following discussion. Please help me welcome Professor Robbie George.
Thank you, Dr. Lutheran, and thank you all for being here this evening. It's a great honor for me to be in your country and in this beautiful city and to participate in the Hanus Days celebration. My talk will indeed be on the subject of marriage this evening, and I would like to dedicate it to all the young couples who are planning to be married, especially my friends, Patricia and Maciej, who will be married just next month and who have taken such good care of me since I arrived in Bratislava the day before yesterday. Thank you. So what is marriage? That's the central question. Before we reach the question, who can be married, who can participate in the institution of marriage, we have to address and answer the question, what is marriage? And I will propose to do that this evening. Marriage is an all-encompassing sharing of life. It involves like other interpersonal bonds, ordinary friendships, partnerships of various sorts. It involves a union of hearts and minds, yes, but also, and distinctively, uniquely, a bodily sharing, a bodily union, a union made possible by the sexual reproductive biological complementarity of male and female, of man and woman. Hence, this relationship is ordered to the all-encompassing good of procreation and family life and calls for an all-encompassing commitment, one that is pledged, unlike other partnerships or relationships, to permanence and to exclusivity and fidelity. Marriage unites husband and wife holistically, not merely as an intense emotional bond, but also on the bodily plane in acts of conjugal love and in the children such love brings forth where the non-behavioral conditions of procreation happen to obtain. And this is for the whole of life. Marriage is a form of relationship, then, indeed the form of relationship, in which a man and woman unite themselves in a bond that is naturally ordered to and would be fulfilled by their conceiving and rearing children together. And those who enter into this form of relationship, the human good of marriage, are truly and fully participants in it, even where their bond is not blessed with the gift of children. To be in such a relationship, a bodily as well as emotional union whose distinctive features and norms are shaped by its orientation to and aptness for procreation and the rearing of children, is intrinsically and not merely instrumentally valuable. It's intelligibly wantable. We can act for the sake of it, not simply as a means to some other end, children, pleasure, social status, something extrinsic, but as an end in itself. So marriage, though bearing an inherent and not merely incidental link to procreation, is not properly understood as having its value merely as a means, even to the great good of conceiving and rearing children. That is why historically and rightly, infertility is not regarded as an impediment to marriage. True bodily union in acts fulfilling the behavioral conditions of procreation is possible even where the non-behavioral conditions of procreation happen not to obtain. And such a union can provide the foundation and matrix of the multi-level sharing of life that marriage is. By multi-level, I mean biological, emotional, rational, dispositional. These insights into the nature of marriage as a human good require no particular theology: Catholic, Protestant, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Islam, Buddhist, Hindu. It doesn't matter. It doesn't presuppose or require any particular theological understanding or religion. They are, to be sure, consistent with Jewish and Christian faith. Yet ancient thinkers untouched by Jewish or Christian revelation, including Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Musonius Rufus, the great Roman Stoic, Xenophanes, and Plutarch, also distinguished conjugal unions from all other types of relationship, as do many non-biblical faiths to this day. Nor did animus against particular persons or categories of persons produce this conclusion, which arose in various cultures long before the modern concept of sexual orientation emerged. Nevertheless, today we have witnessed, here in Europe and in the United States, the radical redefinition of marriage as something other than a conjugal partnership, something other than what I just described. Marriage has been redefined in the United States, for example, to eliminate the norm of sexual complementarity. In truth, what that does is abolish, as a legal category, what has traditionally been known as marriage, a conjugal partnership, and replace it with something different. What's the something different? What it is replaced by is legally recognized sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, to which then the label of marriage is reassigned. Understood as a conjugal relationship, that is, a comprehensive emotional and bodily union oriented toward procreation and the providing of children with both a mother and a father, it is easy to make sense of the core features of marriage as historically understood in Western and in other cultures, here in Europe and in other cultures. However, the elimination of the norm of sexual complementarity removes any ground of principle for these features. After all, if two men or two women can marry, then what sets marriage apart from other bonds must be emotional intensity or priority. But nothing about emotional union or intensity requires it to be permanent as opposed to deliberately temporary, a contract for 5 years renewable or something like that. Nothing beyond mere sentiment or subjective preference would require such a partnership to be sexually closed as opposed to open, or limited to a relationship of two persons as opposed to 3 or 4 or 5 or more in so-called polyamorous sexual ensembles, which of course are today now being promoted and proposed. There would be no ground for understanding marriage as a sexual partnership at all, as opposed to one integrated around any of a range of possible non-sexual shared interests or commitments. For example, playing tennis or reading novels or supporting a certain sports team, soccer team or something. Nor would there be any basis for understanding marriage as a relationship that is inherently enriched by family life and shaped by its demands. Yet these features have always been, across cultures and throughout history, defining features and norms of marriage, features and norms that make marriage unlike in kind and not merely in degree of emotional intensity, other forms of companionship or friendship. These considerations buttress my point that what is at stake in debates about the definition and meaning of marriage is not what is sometimes proposed, that is, to expand marriage to enlarge the pool of people eligible to participate in it. No. What is at stake is whether to retain and support marriage in our law and culture, or to jettison marriage in favor of a different way of organizing human relationships, to which we then simply reassign the label marriage. And whether the name marriage is reassigned to this different way of organizing relationships or not is of no more than merely semantic importance. The words, the labels, don't matter. Marriage law shapes our actions by promoting a vision of what marriage is and therefore what its norms and requirements are. And these affect not only individual partners in a marriage, the spouses, it affects the entire community, indeed the entire nation. A nation with a healthy and functioning marriage culture is much better off in manifold respects than any nation in which the marriage culture has eroded or collapsed. In almost all Western jurisdictions today, marriage has been deeply wounded by a culture of divorce. That's certainly true in the United States and was true in the United States before anyone ever proposed redefining marriage to make it a same-sex kind of relationship. Similarly, the widespread practice of non-marital cohabitation or the normalization of non-marital childbearing and other such practices, all of these have eroded the marriage culture. And none of them has to do with same-sex partnerships or homosexual conduct, nor were or are people who are attracted to persons of the same sex responsible for those social pathologies. It was the impact of these practices on the public understanding of marriage that weakened people's grasp of marriage as a conjugal union and made the otherwise inconceivable idea of same-sex marriages conceivable. Still, abolishing marriage as a legal category and reassigning the label marriage to sexual romantic domestic partnerships completes the route and will make it exceedingly difficult to carry out the reforms needed to restore the conjugal understanding of marriage, and with it, a vibrant and healthy marriage culture. The more we equate marriage with what amounts to sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, the more difficult it will be for people to live by the stabilizing norms specific to true marriage, that is, marriage conceived as a conjugal union. This is the lesson of the past 70 years. Unless we restore a sound understanding of marriage and rebuild the marriage culture, the erosion of marriage ideals will continue to harm everyone, children, spouses, societies as a whole, but especially the poorest and most vulnerable. It is the poorest and most vulnerable communities in larger national communities that have the most to lose, that are harmed the most when the marriage culture begins to erode or where it collapses. All you need to do is visit any inner city of an American urban area where the marriage culture has broken down to see with your own eyes who pays the price for the collapse of the marriage culture. The most vulnerable people, the poorest, the weakest, those with the least resources pay the price. By rewriting the parenting ideal, abolishing conjugal marriage as the legal norm undermines in our mores and practices the special value of biological mothers and fathers, the idea of the norm being mom and dad raising the children that come to them as a result of their marital communion. Moreover, by marking support for the conjugal view as bigotry, which is what happens in the political debates over redefining marriage, the side that stands for the preservation of the conjugal view of marriage are smeared, they're defamed, they're called bigots by people who insist on wanting to change the definition of marriage. And by marking such people as bigots, it damages religious liberty and freedom of speech and association. It's important to bear in mind that under any marriage policy, some bonds, some types of intimate relationship will remain unrecognized, and thus some people will remain legally unmarried, however much they would want their relationships to count as marriages under the law. So we need to be able, and ought to be able, to meet people's concrete needs apart from civil marriage. Moreover, if we reject the equation of marriage with companionship and of marriage licenses with a kind of generic moral approval, we will see that conjugal marriage laws deprive no one of companionship or its joys and mark no one as less worthy of fulfillment. True compassion means extending authentic community to everyone, especially the marginalized, the vulnerable, while using marriage law for the social goal that it serves best and that justifies regulating such intimate bonds in the first place, and that is to ensure that children know the committed love of the mother and father whose union brought them into being in the first place. Understood from the legal point of view, what marriage is the bond that connects man and woman as husband and wife to bring up children born of their union, conferring upon those children the inestimable blessing of being brought up in the committed love, the marital love of the man and woman whose union brought them together, their mother and their father, demonstrating, modeling for their children, their boys and their girls alike, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a husband, what it means to be a wife, what it means to be a father, what it means to be a mother. Robust support for true marital norms, what I call marriage reality, serves children, spouses, and hence our whole economy, especially the poor. Family breakdown thrusts the state into roles for which the state is very ill-suited: parent and discipliner to the orphaned and neglected, and arbiter of disputes over custody and paternity. Here again, if you want to see it, it's a very easy thing to do. Just go into the inner city of any American urban community where the family has broken down, and you will see that the state has had to step in to play the role of mommy and daddy. Now, let me now address the issue at a deeper, more philosophical level. Everyone agrees that marriage, whatever else it is or does, is a relationship in which persons are fully united. But what are persons? What do we mean by persons? If marriage unites persons, what is it that we mean by persons? We know that people can't marry a wall because the wall is not a person. Someone may now propose such a thing, but people don't accept that. People don't think you can marry the cat, your pet, because the cat is not a person. So to understand what marriage is as a union of persons, we need to explore the question, what is a person? And that turns out to be a more complicated philosophical question than it might first appear. The view typically, if only implicitly held, by advocates of liberal positions on issues of sexual morality in marriage is that the person is the conscious and desiring aspect of the self, the psyche. The person, that is the mind, the psyche, the center of consciousness and emotion, inhabits or somehow is associated with and uses a body, a material body. But the material body is not the person. The person is the mind or psyche, center of consciousness, or if you want to put a religious spin on it, the spirit, the soul, that inhabits the body. So what a human being is a non-bodily person inhabiting and using a non-personal body. The body is considered sub-personal, a vessel, a physical vessel, rather than part of the personal reality of the human being whose body it is. The body is viewed then as an extrinsic instrument by which the individual produces or otherwise participates in satisfactions and other desirable experiences and realizes various goals. Now, for those who formally or more often informally, only implicitly, perhaps without ever thinking about it very clearly, for those who accept this dualistic understanding of what human beings are, psyches inhabiting bodies, ghosts in machines, personal unity cannot be achieved by bodily unity because the body is a subpersonal instrument. It's not the person. What's the person? The psyche. And this takes us to the very crux of the debate about the meaning of marriage and its nature. According to this dualistic view of human beings, persons unite emotionally, or if you take a religious, want to use religious language, spiritually. Now, of course, if this is true, then persons of the same sex can indeed unite maritally, that is, form a very strong emotional bond, and they can share erotic experiences that they suppose will enhance their personal union by enabling them to express affection, share pleasure, and feel more intensely by virtue of their sex play. Now, of course, by the same token, ensembles of 3 or more persons can unite psychologically or emotionally by forming an intense emotional bond and can share erotic experiences that they suppose will enhance their polyamorous union. Now, the alternative to the dualistic view of what persons are, and therefore of how persons can be united in marriage, is the one embraced in both the historic law of marriage and in what the late Sir Isaiah Berlin described as the central tradition of Western thought, that tradition shaped by both Athens and Jerusalem, by the Greco-Roman philosophical traditions and by Judeo-Christian religion. According to this anti-dualist view, what human beings are bodily persons, not consciousnesses or minds or spirits inhabiting and using non-personal bodies, not, in other words, ghosts in machines. A human person, rather, is a dynamic unity of body, mind, and spirit. Far from being an extrinsic instrument of the person, the body is intrinsically part of the personal reality of the human being. What then unites in marriage, if marriage unites persons? What unites is the whole person, the integrated unity, the composite of body, mind, and spirit. It is precisely in that sense that marriage is a holistic or comprehensive bond, that spouses share life at all levels of their human being, the biological, the emotional, the rational dispositional, the spiritual. But at the foundation, the matrix of that multi-level sharing of life is precisely the biological unity made possible by sexual biological complementarity. So, the bodily union we are here considering is possible because human males and females unite organically, holistically, when they mate. Though two, they become one as the single unified subject performing the act which fulfills the behavioral conditions of procreation. That is why mating is something distinct and different from merely rubbing together, even erotic rubbing together. And mating remains mating and no mere rubbing together, even when the non-behavioral conditions of procreation happen not to obtain. That's why the zoologists or the farmer can distinguish acts of mating, even in non-human animals, cows or pigs or what have you, from failures to mate, no matter how much rubbing together has gone on, without the need to wait to see whether conception has occurred, whether a calf has been conceived, say. Conception itself, though a consequence of mating, where the non-behavioral conditions of reproduction obtain, is distinct from the act of mating itself. The mating happens, and either a baby will come or won't come. But the baby's coming or not coming doesn't determine whether mating has taken place. Whether mating has occurred is one thing, whether it has resulted in conception is something else. To understand the sense in which marriage as a bodily founded relationship, as a biological and not merely an emotional relationship, unites two as one, I sometimes ask my students, how many of you have a pulmonary system? Everybody raises their hands. How many of you have a neural system? Everyone raises their hands. Then I say, how many of you have a reproductive system? Here they realize I'm up to something, that I'm laying a trap. And so they hesitantly begin to raise their hand. And I say, yes, exactly, you were right. You have half a reproductive system. You have the male or female half. Reproduction is a single act, but unlike locomotion or digestion, it's performed not by an individual human being, but by a male and female as a mated pair. This leaves the question then of the existential and moral significance of human mating. Given that humans do become one in the bodily and not merely emotional sense by mating, the body being part of the personal reality of the human being and not a mere vessel or subpersonal instrument, what follows from that normatively? What follows from that as a matter of moral judgment? What follows about the meaning of marriage as a distinctive human good? To move toward answers, let us explore a bit more the concept of bodily union as personal union. In the bodily union made possible by sexual reproductive complementarity, the two partners, the male and female spouses, while remaining distinct persons, together form a distinctive, single, reproductive principle. Although, as I say, reproduction is a single act in humans as well as other species, the reproductive act is performed not by the individual members of the species, but by the mated pair as an organic unit. The late Germain Grisey carefully explained the point in the following way, and I quote him, "Though a male and a female are complete individuals with respect to other functions, for example, nutrition, sensation, and locomotion. With respect to reproduction, they are only potential halves, potential parts of a mating pair, which is the complete organism capable of reproducing sexually. Even if the mated pair is sterile, intercourse, provided it's the reproductive behavior characteristic of the species, makes the copulating male and female one organism. And that's as true of non-human animals as it is of human animals. That is, in the case of non-human animals that are sexually dimorphic and reproduce sexually. Now, what is unique about marriage is that it truly is a comprehensive sharing of life. It's not like just an ordinary friendship. It's a union not only of hearts and minds, which ordinary friendships are, but also of bodies. Indeed, this comprehensive sharing is founded on the bodily union, made uniquely possible by the sexual reproductive complementarity that allows a man and a woman to become, in the language of the Bible, one flesh. And that makes this one flesh union the foundation of the relationship in which it is intelligible and not merely as a matter of subjective preference for two people to bind themselves to each other in pledges of permanence, monogamy, and sexual fidelity. I cannot stress enough the importance in trying to understand what marriage is and what it's not, what it is and what it cannot be. Cannot stress enough that our account of what it is must account for its features such as permanence. We pledge to marry, doesn't always work out this way, but we pledge to marry until death do us part. We do not pledge to marry for 5 years renewable. We pledge monogamy. We pledge fidelity. We pledge sexual exclusivity, not open marriages. Our account of marriage has to give an account of why those norms make sense. The conjugal account of marriage, that understanding of marriage, does so. A contrary understanding of, quote, marriage, unquote, as sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership can simply give no account of those, nor can it give any account of why marriage is of any interest to the state. Ordinary friendships are of no interest to the state. You don't have to register your friendships. Baptisms are of no interest to the state. You don't have to register with the state your baptism. You register it with the church. In the Jewish community, bar mitzvahs are not registered with the state. They are simply registered with the synagogue, with the Jewish community. Why is marriage different? Why, across cultures and over time, does the state take cognizance? It's because of the kind of relationship marriage is, one that is ordered to, naturally ordered to, the coming to be of children who are the product of the sexual complementarity, the union of husband and wife. Now, people who reject this understanding of sex and marriage have slogans such as love makes a family. And it does not matter, they say, whether the love is between two people of opposite sexes or the same sex. Now, those who are clear-headed and candid acknowledge that by the same logic, it would not matter if the love were among 3 people or 5 people, so-called thruples or quintets or what have you. Nor does the form of sexual expression of that love make any difference. Arguments that true marriage is something other than or broader than the union of 2 sexually complementary spouses necessarily suppose that the value of sex must be instrumental either to procreation or to pleasure considered as an end in itself or as a means of expressing affection, tender feelings, and so forth. Critics of traditional norms of marriage and sexuality say that sexual acts of same-sex partners, for example, are indistinguishable from the acts of coitus of spouses whenever the motivation for the sexual union is something other than procreation. That is to say, the sexual acts of same-sex partners, they say, are indistinguishable in motivation, meaning, value, and significance from the marital acts of spouses who know that at least one spouse is temporarily or perhaps even permanently infertile. Thus, the argument goes, the traditional understanding of marriage is guilty of unfairness, of a double standard, in treating sterile persons of opposite sexes as capable of marrying, while treating same-sex partners as ineligible to marry. My friend and colleague at Princeton, Professor Stephen Macedo, has accused the traditional view, my view, and its defenders of precisely this double standard. He asks, what is the point of sex in an infertile marriage? Not procreation. The partners, let us assume, know that they are infertile. If they have sex, it is for pleasure and to express their love or friendship or some other good. It will be for precisely the same reason that committed, loving gay couples have sex, unquote. Now, many people find this criticism impressive, and even some conservatively oriented people seem to find themselves stumped by it, unable to give an answer to it. Once the core of the traditional view, though, is brought into focus, it's clear that this criticism straightforwardly fails because it presupposes that the point of sex in marriage can only be instrumental, either to having children considered as extrinsic objects of the sexual act, or for the sake of pleasure, or to express tender feelings, or something like that. In fact, a central tenet of the traditional view is that the point of sex is the good of marriage itself, consummated in the first instance, and then actualized in and through sexual acts that unite the spouses as one flesh, their bodily communion being integrally and constitutively part of their comprehensive marital union as embodied persons. That is, not as ghosts in machines, which the liberal view presupposes, not as psyches inhabiting bodies, but as embodied persons, the view of the person that Aristotle, in embracing it, described as hylomorphism. Thus, the traditional view rejects the instrumentalizing of sex, and thus of the bodies of sexual partners, to extrinsic ends of any sort. Procreation and pleasure are rightly sought, but they are integrated with the basic good and justifying point of marital intercourse, namely the one flesh union of marriage itself. Now again, critics of the traditional understanding of marriage who grasp this point must therefore argue that the apparent one flesh unity that distinguishes marital intercourse from other types of sexual conduct is illusory, an illusion. The apparent bodily communion of spouses in acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation is not really possible, they say. Professor Macedo, for example, claims that the one flesh communion of sterile spouses, and I quote him, would appear to be more a matter of appearance than reality, unquote. Because of their sterility, such couples, he says, really cannot unite biologically. Their bodies cannot form a single reproductive principle, no real unity. Indeed, Macedo argues that even fertile couples who conceive children in acts of sexual intercourse do not truly unite biologically because, he says, penises and vaginas do not unite biologically, sperm and egg do. Well, John Finnis, my mentor and Martin's, has aptly replied that, quote, in this reductivist word legislating mood, one might declare that sperm and egg unite only physically, and only their pronuclei are biologically united. But it would be more realistic to acknowledge that the whole process of copulation is biological through and through. Moreover, as Finnis points out, the organic unity, which is instantiated in an act of the reproductive kind, is not, as Macedo reductively imagines, the unity of penis and vagina. It is the unity of the persons in the intentional, consensual act of sexual intercourse. If the body is part of the person, then our reproductive system is not plumbing. It's not an instrument of ours that we use. It is us, every bit as much of us as our feelings, desires, emotions, thoughts. Who acts? The whole person acts as a body-mind, body-spirit composite. The unity to which Finnis here refers, unity of body, sense, emotion, reason, will, is central to our understanding of humanness. Yet it is a unity of which Macedo and others who deny the possibility of true bodily communion in marriage can give no account. For this denial presupposes that dualism of person as conscious and desiring self on the one hand, and body as an instrument of the conscious and desiring self, on the other hand, which is flatly incompatible with this unity. The dualism of person and body is implicit in the idea, central to Macedo's denial of the possibility of one-flesh union, that non-coital sexual acts differ from what law and philosophy have traditionally regarded as chaste and honorable marital acts only as a matter of the arrangement of what Macedo labels, yes, the plumbing. According to this idea, the genital organs of an infertile woman or man are not really reproductive organs, any more than, say, mouths or rectums or tongues or fingers are reproductive organs. Thus, the intercourse of a man and a woman where at least one partner is infertile cannot really be an act of the reproductive type. But the plain fact is that the genitalia of men and women are reproductive organs all the time, even during periods of sterility. Acts that fulfill the behavioral conditions of procreation are acts of the procreative kind, even where the non-behavioral conditions of procreation do not obtain. Insofar as the point of sexual intercourse is marital union, a point central to the historic understanding of marriage as a conjugal relationship, the spouses achieve the desired unity, they unite biologically as one flesh, precisely insofar as they mate. Or to put the same point another way, so long as they perform the type of act on which the gift of a child may supervene, what traditional law and philosophy have always referred to as the act of generation, or the conjugal act. It's the act that consummates a marriage. A marriage is not complete, not just as a matter of canon law, but even, at least in our country, in the United States, as a matter of civil law. It's not complete simply with the vows and the ceremony, whether it's in the church or a public registry office. It's not complete and perfected until it's consummated precisely by an act that fulfills the behavioral conditions of procreation. And it's fully a consummated union whether the act produces a child or not. Of course, these days, the views Macedo advances are mainstream. They are overwhelmingly accepted by the liberal elements of society, and the defense of the conjugal view is regarded as anomalous. Indeed, many consider that liberal view about sex and marriage itself to be too old-fashioned, even conservative. Professor Macedo himself and other defenders of the so-called moderate liberal position have been taken to task by those to their left for affirming the principle of sexual fidelity and criticizing, if only implicitly usually, promiscuity and sexually open marriages. So Professor Macedo gets more criticism at Princeton even than I do. He gets criticized for saying that couples, whether they're same-sex or opposite sex, should be faithful to each other, should not have sex with people that they are not in that two-person bond with. You see how quickly it moves from one position that seems radical today, but tomorrow now seems conservative, to the next still more radical position, to the next still more radical position. And that's inevitable once you've removed the conjugal understanding of marriage, thus removing any principled basis for the norms that structure marriage, monogamy, fidelity, permanence of commitment, and so forth. So, Macedo himself has an admirable commitment to the notion of marriage as permanent and exclusive, but he thinks that the nature of the sexual activity does not matter. Sex is sex. It cannot be, in his view, something that unites people as one flesh or enables them to be truly one. They remain separate, each having their own experiences of sex, but giving those experiences as a gift to each other, expressing their affection for each other in this special sexual way. But once marriage and marital intercourse are reduced to the status of instrumental goods, the only intelligible point of entering into a marriage will be the achievement of some other end or ends. For some, certainly, the end of marriage will be procreation. But whether a particular marriage is a reproductive alliance or an alliance for purposes entirely unrelated to reproduction is purely a matter of subjective preferences of the parties who enter into the alliance. In no way is marriage considered to be naturally ordered to the coming to be and nurturing of children, nor are the contours of the marital state or the terms of the marital relationship understood to be established or shaped by a natural orientation toward child rearing. So marriage on this revised understanding is marked by a plasticity, or malleability that sharply distinguishes it from the conception of marriage it is proposed to replace. In this revisionist understanding, marriage is also unnecessary, even for child rearing. If 2 or perhaps more, 3, 5 people find or suppose that the state of being married works for them, then they have a reason to marry. If not, then marriage is not, as a matter of principle, understood to be a uniquely or even especially apt context for them to structure their lives together. What about sex? What is the point of that in the revised conception of marriage? Well, the worldview, sometimes referred to as expressive individualism or lifestyle liberalism, the dominant view on the left, at least in the United States today, rejects the belief that sex is properly to be restricted to the marital bond. It certainly has no ground of principle to object to sexual cohabitation outside of marriage. And even with regard to sex apart from stable relationships, lifestyle liberalism claims to be non-judgmental. Its main principle of rectitude in sexual matters is the principle of consent, not, as in the traditional view, the principle of marriage. What makes sex good sex rather than bad sex? On the traditional view, it's whether it's marital or not. It's whether it's in the marital bond expressing marital love. In the new revisionist sense, it is whether it is consented to. If it's consented to, it's good. If it's not consented to, it's bad. So long as there is no coercion or deceit in the procurement of sex, sexual choices, as one American liberal, Frederick Elliston, insists, does not even raise moral questions. Even adultery is unproblematic under the expressive individualist conception of marriage. If, as in so-called open marriages, there's no deception of a spouse involved, the couple just decides we're going to have sexual relationships with other people on the side, and they agree to it. If they agree to it, it's fine. No moral questions arise. Indeed, under the expressive individualist conception, it's impossible to identify any reason, there are only subjective preferences, for spouses to demand fidelity of each other. If one spouse wants to have relationships, sexual relationships with other people, and let's say his spouse, let's say his wife says, I don't want you to do that, she is then accused of being selfish, being insecure, being someone who is denying to her husband something that he wants and would be good for him. Why should people forsake all others, as we say in the marital ceremony? What is the point of sexual fidelity? There is no reason, strictly speaking, on this liberal view, not to have an open marriage. Only emotions or purely subjective preferences that some people happen to have and other people don't have. This is why people who reject the traditional terms of marriage, even those like Macedo who do so for putatively conservative reasons, for instance, to make the good of marriage available to people who prefer erotic experiences with persons of their own sex, find it impossible in the end to condemn promiscuity and the like, except occasionally and on pragmatic grounds. It may spread STDs, venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, or something like that. My point that redefining marriage as sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership to accommodate same-sex relations erodes the basis for permanence and exclusivity in any relationship is increasingly confirmed by the rhetoric and arguments of the advocates of this view themselves and by the policies that they've been increasingly led to embrace. Professor Elizabeth Brake in the United States, for example, supports what she calls minimal marriage. In that arrangement, individuals can have legal relationships with more than one person, two-person relationships, but also three-person, four-person, five-person, reciprocally or asymmetrically for themselves, determining the sex and the number of parties, the type of relationship involved, and which rights and responsibilities to exchange. Judith Stacy, a prominent New York University professor, testified before Congress against what was called the Defense of Marriage Act, expressing the hope that the redefinition of marriage to include same-sex partners would give marriage, and I quote Professor Stacy, varied, creative, and adaptive contours, leading us to question the dyadic limitations of Western marriage, that is the restriction of marriage to two people, and seek small group marriages, three-person or four-person marriages. In their statement beyond same-sex marriage, more than 300 LGBT and allied scholars, as they styled themselves, advocated for legally recognizing relationships involving more than two partners. Nor are such relationships unheard of. Newsweek magazine, a very prominent magazine in the United States, reports that there are more than 500,000 group sexual relationships in the United States alone. In Brazil, a public notary has recognized a trio of 3 people as a civil union. Mexico City is considered expressly temporary marriage licenses. You marry for the number of years you specify, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years. The Toronto District School Board has taken to promoting polyamorous relationships among its students. What about the connection to family life? Well, writer E.J. Graff celebrates the fact that recognizing same-sex unions would change the message of the institution of marriage so that it would ever after stand for sexual choice, cutting the link, she says, between sex and diapers. Enacting same-sex marriage, she says, does more than just fit. It announces that marriage has changed shape, and indeed, it changes marriage. I would agree with her about the consequences. We just disagree about whether the consequences are desirable. What about sexual exclusivity? Andrew Sullivan, a very famous self-styled proponent of what he calls the conservative case for same-sex marriage, has gone so far as to extol the, I quote him, spirituality of anonymous sex. I had to look up what anonymous sex is. I learned that is sex with someone with whom you don't exchange names. You don't reveal who you are to each other. You have sex with each other without revealing who you are. And this allegedly conservative proponent of same-sex marriage claims that anonymous sexual liaisons can have spiritual value. And he welcomes the fact that openness of same-sex unions might erode sexual exclusivity among those in opposite-sex marriages. In other words, if we enact same-sex marriage, it will loosen the norm of fidelity and make opposite-sex couples, traditional married couples, more open-minded about having open relationships where they can have sex with partners other than their spouses. Some have advocated redefining marriage precisely to weaken the norms of exclusivity and fidelity. Now, a standard revisionist response to the defense of conjugal marriage that I'm here proposing is the claim that even if the traditional position is, from the moral point of view, true, it's nevertheless unfair for the law to embody it. Again, Professor Macedo, for example, argues that if disagreements about the nature of marriage, quote, lie in difficult philosophical quarrels about which reasonable people have long disagreed, then our differences lie in precisely the territory that John Rawls rightly marks off as inappropriate to the fashioning of our basic rights and liberties, unquote. Well, as far as the claim that same-sex marriage would make no moral statement, but would be morally neutral as between traditional marriage ideas and more liberal marriage ideas, I think I disposed of that in my lecture yesterday. No such neutrality is possible. The law will either treat marriage as a conjugal partnership, or the law will treat marriage as a form of sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership. There is no middle ground here. There is no neutral position. Doing the latter while claiming that you're merely being neutral is just false. You are adopting a particular position, a moral view of what marriage is. The law is a teacher. It will teach either that marriage is a reality in which people can choose to participate, but whose contours people cannot make and remake at will, or it will teach that marriage is a mere convention, which is malleable in such a way that individuals, couples, or larger groups can choose to make it or make of it whatever suits their desires and goals. The result, given the biases of human sexual psychology, will be the development of practices and ideologies that truly tend to undermine the sound understanding and practice of marriage, together with the development of pathologies that tend to reinforce the very practices and ideologies that cause them. The late Joseph Raz, who was one of my teachers at Oxford, was a liberal who did not share my views regarding sexual morality, but he was rightly critical of forms of liberalism, including Rawlsianism, that suppose law and government can and should be neutral among competing conceptions of moral goodness. He noted, for example, that, and I quote him, this is very important, he says something here very profound, monogamy, assuming that it is the only valuable form of marriage, cannot be practiced by an individual. It requires a culture which recognizes it and which supports it through the public's attitude and through its formal and informal institutions, unquote. Bingo. He's absolutely right. We've got to make a choice. That choice will be a moral commitment one way or another. There is no neutral position. There's no neutral position between monogamy and polygamy. There is no neutral position between the conjugal view of marriage and the revisionist view of marriage as sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership. Now, of course, Raz did not suppose that in a culture whose law and public policy monogamy is not supported, a man who happens to believe in it somehow will be unable to restrict himself to having one wife or will be required to have or take additional wives. Raz's point, rather, was that even if monogamy is a key element in a sound understanding of marriage, large numbers of people will fail to understand that or understand why that is the case, and will therefore fail to grasp the value of monogamy and the point of practicing it unless they are assisted by a culture that supports it formally by law and policy as well as by informal means. For monogamy to flourish, it requires a culture of monogamy. And what is true of monogamy is equally true of the other elements of a sound understanding of marriage. In short, and to conclude, marriage is the kind of good that can be chosen and meaningfully participated in only by people who have at least an elementary, implicit understanding of it and who choose it with that understanding in mind. Yet, people's ability to understand it, at least implicitly, and thus to choose it, depends crucially on institutions and cultural understandings that both transcend individual choice and are constituted by a vast number of individual choices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, professor. Predtým, ako prejdeme na otázky, tak ešte budeme mať hudobné vystúpenie Alžbety Dzurovej a Marcela Petráša, ktorí nám zahrajú dve krátke Mozartové etudy. A verím tomu, že počas toho budete môcť klásť aj otázky cez slajdo. Neviem ako, ale verím, že sa nám tu zjaví nejaký QR kód, aby sme ich mohli sformulovať. Je to tak? A bude aj mikrofón, že budete môcť klásť otázky, keď nemáte smartfóny, aj osobne. Super, takže teraz poprosím našich hudobníkov. Nech sa páči. All right. So, thank you again for a very sophisticated and wonderful lecture. We have a lot of questions on Slido, but before I choose one of them, can I just ask you? I know you've talked about a lot in your lecture, but could you just summarize the harm that this change of the marriage culture that you were talking about would do to marriage? So, in other words, the most common objection, right, is of people who are advocating for same-sex marriage. What harm is that going to do to you? How is that going to harm your marriage when I also have the same right that you do? What would be your answer to this objection?
Well, first, there is a problem with the objection itself. If someone asserts, I want the same right that you have, the right that I'm claiming people have is a right to enter into marriage understood as a conjugal partnership. Everyone has the eligibility for that. That's not excluding anybody.
But how would it harm? How would it harm?
So the next question is the harm, right? So we saw long before the debate over redefining marriage to include same-sex partners arose, the destructive effects of the erosion of the conjugal understanding of marriage. We saw that beginning with the rise of the divorce culture, out-of-wedlock childbearing, non-marital sexual cohabitation, and so forth. We know who the victims primarily were: children, and the weakest and poorest and most vulnerable. Just at the point when we should have been focusing on rebuilding the marriage culture, restructuring our divorce law to make it less accessible, taking steps to strengthen marriages, taking steps to discourage out-of-wedlock childbearing and so forth, trying to reverse the erosion of the conjugal understanding of marriage, a proposal comes to redefine marriage to permanently do away with the conjugal understanding of marriage, to eliminate it from our law. Most of the harm had been done, as I said in my lecture, before anybody proposed changing the law to accept same-sex partnerships, to recognize same-sex partnerships as marriage. What changing the law to abolish the conjugal understanding of marriage does is locks it in permanently. It means there's no going back. Some of you have probably seen the movie Dr. Zhivago. Do you ever seen the movie Dr. Zhivago? The original Dr. Zhivago with Omar Sharif. When the elderly uncle learns, a very loyal Russian who was very loyal to the Tsar, learned that the communists had shot the Tsar, he said with great pain and depression, why did they do that? Why did they have to do that? And the answer that was given by the Omar Sharif character was, so there will be no going back. That's the danger here, that there is no going back. Once we've locked into our law, the revised understanding of marriage is essentially sexual reproductive companionship or domestic partnership. There is simply no going back.
So is there going back? I mean, one of the questions is, given the popularity of same-sex marriage and given what you just said about going back and about how the marriage was redefined in the US, even by the Supreme Court, right? How should conservatives work to recover traditional marriage politically and in the culture? Is it even possible?
Yeah, there's no inevitability in human affairs. One of the things that the communists, despite failing, somehow persuaded even conservative people is that there's a trajectory to history, that once some steps are taken, you're on a road and history is going in a particular direction. This Marx got from Hegel and the left picked up from Marx, and now almost everybody seems somehow or another to believe it. And so if you question some liberal dogma, what is the response? It's, oh, you are putting yourself on the wrong side of history. Have you ever heard that? Yeah. They say that here, they say that in the United States all the time. This is a myth that there is a right and wrong side of history. History is an impersonal sequence of events. It has no more power to judge than a painted totem pole or a stone outcropping. The idea of a judgment of history is just secularism's vain and hopeless attempt to substitute something for the God of the Bible, a God who judges. They were trying to replace the judgment of God with the judgment of history. Everything depends on what men and women decide they are going to do. Now, things can be more difficult or less difficult. If you revise marriage law, you're going to make it a lot more difficult to reach the reforms that should have been taken earlier. But it can still be done. It takes leadership. You know, do you remember the Brezhnev? You in the Slovak Republic surely remember the Brezhnev Doctrine. Remember the Brezhnev Doctrine? Do you know what it was? The Brezhnev Doctrine was the basic idea that the communists promoted, in which even the anti-communists in the United States, people like Jean Kirkpatrick, very great anti-communist woman in the United States, professor and ambassador, came to believe. The Brezhnev Doctrine said, what we take, we keep. Once communism has taken a land, there's no going back. So in the United States, the anti-communists believing this, believing the Brezhnev Doctrine, stressed the importance of the doctrine of containment. All we can do is stop communism from spreading. We can't roll it back where it has taken power. We can stop it from spreading, and that's what we should commit ourselves to doing. But three important people said, why should we believe the Brezhnev Doctrine? There's no inevitability in history. It's up to us. Those three people were Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II. And it wasn't believed by people like Václav Havel and people like Lech Walesa. And so they acted. And they did what they were told was impossible. Well, the impossible always looks impossible until you do it. And you do it by acting, by being bold, by refusing to be intimidated. I think this is the greatest obstacle to reversing course on marriage. This is the greatest obstacle to reform and to resisting the temptation to redefine marriage. It's people are afraid of being called a name. They're afraid of being called, you're a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're a bad person. They're afraid of having their reputation smeared. They're afraid of not being accepted. People like to be accepted. It's human nature. We like that. We want other people to accept us. But sometimes that's too high a price to pay for something as valuable, as important to human flourishing, human well-being, to children, to the poor, as marriage. So we have to take the risk of being called a name. Yeah, okay, call me a name. But I'm going to stand up and I'm going to defend it because I think it's good and true and right.
I'm sure you've been called these names before, right? Many times.
And look at the harm it's done me.
And what would be the first step in this going back?
Well, first, if for any culture that has not redefined marriage, stop, do not redefine marriage. Stand up against the intimidation, the bullying, the name-calling, and so forth, in a spirit of love. This is all about love. It's about flourishing. It's about the well-being of people. It's about the well-being of children. We have seen the carnage of the sexual revolution. It's everywhere to see. It is not good. It has not been a success. It has not liberated people. It has not fulfilled its promise from 1948 with Kinsey or 1953 with Hefner or the 1960s or anything like that. It's been an unqualified disaster. And yet people are afraid to speak out against it. So we need to be working, and not just on the issue of same-sex marriage. To some extent, that's a side issue. It's a secondary issue. The more fundamental issue is the broader sexual revolution that involves the sexual conduct of people who are not same-sex attracted. Before there was ever an issue of gay anything, you had all the problems of the 1960s and the sexual revolution. We have to address those problems. We have to fight back against the culture of divorce, even in the church, even in the Catholic Church. We need much more effective programs that we have in helping young couples to build good marriages. They have to understand what marriage is so they can build it. Yet so often the institutions of the church fail to actually communicate to young men and women what marriage is. And we have to assist them. And families have to assist young couples to make their marriages successful. Some of what needs to happen is the reform of the law. I don't know the law here well enough to say what I think the reform should be, but I know what the reform should be in the United States. We adopted the policy of no-fault divorce, which is an absolute catastrophe, as it turned out. It seemed like a good idea at the time, like lots of good ideas, and had catastrophic consequences for children. So we need to reform that. But a lot of what needs to be done isn't in the law. It's in other aspects of the culture. And here I think religious institutions, working across religious lines, here in the Slovak Republic, again, I don't know the situation terribly well, but I've learned enough just today to know that the Catholic leadership here could work very well with the Lutheran leadership here on joint programs to defend the institution of marriage and to help young men and women to form good and lasting and stable and solid and sound marriages. We can reach across all sorts of lines, class lines, ethnic lines, and as I say, religious lines. But somebody's got to do it, which means somebody's got to step forward to provide the leadership. We need the Reagan, the Thatcher, the John Paul, the Valenza, the Havel in the cultural sphere.
The most popular question is actually not a question, but Dinesh asked it. Maybe he will add a question. It says, Fundamental Law of Hungary, Article 1. I quote, Hungary shall protect the institution of marriage as the union of a man and a woman established by voluntary decision. End of quote. What's the question, Dinesh?
I think that was informational for me. I did not know this, but I'm glad to hear it.
Maybe there is a question. Ahoy. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Just click
Ahoy, sziasztok. Ďakujem, köszönöm, thank you for the invitation. My name's Dénes András Nagy. I'm from the Center for Fundamental Rights, which is a Christian conservative think tank in Hungary. And my question is this. Do you agree that we need to include in our constitutions the traditional conservative understanding of marriage? And if you see my second comment there, I'll showcase that our conservative Christian governing coalition, Fidesz and KDNP, amended our constitution to say the mother shall be a woman, the father shall be a man. And they gave us hell for this, but we don't care because in Hungary, conservatism is mainstream, the population supports us, and we will put that through. So my question to you is, do you agree with the idea that when in government, conservative Christian Democrats need to codify conservative traditional understandings of marriage?
Yes, different constitutional systems, of course, are different. We in the United States have a federal system, like Germany in some ways. And marriage law is not a national matter. It is a state matter. So we fight the battles about marriage, about divorce, about child custody law. All of this is done on a state-by-state basis. But when, before the Supreme Court stepped in and imposed national same-sex marriage, redefined marriage from Washington, D.C. on all of the states, I drafted a constitutional amendment which got some support. It was not obviously enacted, but got considerable support, which would have been the 28th Amendment to the American Constitution, which would have established at the constitutional level that marriage is the conjugal union of husband and wife. So I do think that nations should do that consistently with their constitutional system. So I gather Slovakia is a unitary system. The general jurisdiction lies with the central state. So you would do it, if you did it in the way I would like you to do it, you would enact a law at the national parliamentary level or write it into your national constitution. But again, I don't know the...
Yeah, we have that. We actually have that at our national constitution. But that doesn't stop politically the discussion about registered partnerships, which we haven't discussed yet, but we can briefly. What do you think about registered partnerships?
Well, I did an actual, what do they call these, natural experiments. I did a natural experiment with this during the American debate over redefining marriage. The Supreme Court of the state of New Jersey, so we have a national Supreme Court. That's the court that imposed same-sex marriage. It's also the court that imposed abortion, and that was for 50 years until a later Supreme Court a few years ago reversed the decision imposing abortion, which now leaves the American states free to protect unborn children. So sometimes the court can be prevailed on to change its mind, although it might take 50 years as it did in the abortion case. But we have a national Supreme Court and we have state Supreme Courts. So the New Jersey State Supreme Court handed down a ruling saying that the state legislature of New Jersey must to fulfill the Constitution, which, by the way, said nothing about marriage. The judges were just making this up out of thin air. They were just manufacturing it. Lay that aside. It said the state legislature must either adopt same-sex marriage, they must redefine marriage to include same-sex couples, or provide a civil unions or civil partnerships law that gives all the tangible benefits of marriage to same-sex couples on the same terms that married couples get them. So I appeared in the New Jersey legislature, and my experiment was I wanted to see what the people on the other side, what my opponents would do with my proposal. So I said to the state of New Jersey legislature, let's make our civil unions law, which are now being required by the Supreme Court of the state to adopt, even more inclusive. Even more inclusive. You will get everything you want, people on the other side. You get hospital visitation, insurance rights, inheritance, and so forth. But any two people can enter into a civil union. We will not make civil unions predicated on the existence or supposition that there is a sexual partnership between the civil partners. After all, what should sex have to do with it? You could have two elderly sisters. They're widowed or were never married. They live together. They take care of each other. They have mutual responsibility. They need each other's insurance coverage. They need to be able to make medical decisions for each other. They should inherit each other's property. Shouldn't they be able to have a civil union? You can still have your civil union. Anybody, whether they're in a sexual relationship or not, can have a civil union. It's even more inclusive. Isn't this a wonderful idea? They opposed it. They opposed it? What is there to oppose? They insisted that the benefits be predicated on there being a sexual partnership, which shows that they weren't interested in the benefits at all. It was all about the approval of the sexual partnership. It was all about trying to change the cultural understanding of sex. And my natural experiment proved it.
But if they agreed?
Fine.
Okay. All right. You already mentioned no-fault.
They won't.
Yeah. We kind of had a similar experiment here not so long ago. You mentioned no-fault divorce as a problem, but would you agree with prohibiting divorce altogether, with changing law in such a way that divorce would not be possible?
No, I think that would be a mistake. Of course, in an ideal world, there would be no divorce. But you know, if you eliminate divorce altogether, it would have all sorts of unintended bad side effects, falsifications, lying, the corruption of the legal system. So I don't think that's a good idea, and we do need certain ways to take care of, especially women who end up in situations that are in which they are very vulnerable and need protection from abusive husbands. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes the husband is physically abused by the wife, but that's less common, at least in the United States. Far less common than here. There's some situations in which child custody is a serious question because you need to get the child away from a parent. Sometimes, most often, of course, again, it's the father. Not always, but sometimes, most of the time. So the law that the United States had prior to changing to no-fault divorce was a fault system in which the court had to actually examine the situation to see, first of all, whether the divorce was being contested or not, so that a divorce could not be imposed, usually on a woman, couldn't be imposed on a woman who didn't want the divorce. Typical case, husband reaches middle age, his eye wanders, he sees this young woman, he goes chasing after the young woman, he abandons the wife, and the wife doesn't want the divorce. She wants her family reunited. She thinks her husband will come to his senses after he goes through his midlife crisis. You have midlife crises over here? Slovak men have midlife crises?
Not at all,
No, we have them in the United States. When I had mine, I bought a new banjo. But some people don't buy crazy things, or cars or things. They go chasing after their secretaries or assistants or something. So the wife says, well, when he comes to his senses, he'll come back. We don't want a divorce. And there's a fault system. And so divorce was far less common. And here's the most important thing. We did not create a culture of divorce. We didn't create a situation where people were encouraged by the law to think of marriage as something that is worthwhile when everything's going great and you like it and you like her or she likes you and everything's fine. But you know, if you're no longer getting along very well, you're no longer pleased by it, she no longer pleases you, now she's got wrinkles on her face and so forth and so on, you can't just jump away from it. You can't just leave it. It's the cultural understanding that the law promotes. Remember in my remarks, I said law is a teacher. This was not a novel insight with me. Aristotle taught this. Law is a teacher. It shapes culture. It's true that law is shaped by culture, but law also shapes culture. It shapes people's understanding of what they are getting into, what they're doing, what the commitment is, what their obligations are when they get married. And the culture created by no-fault divorce has turned marriage into just another commodity. So it's like buying a car. You buy a car, you keep it when you like it. When you get tired of the car, you throw it away and you get a new car. Well, that marriage is not like that. Shouldn't be like that. So the law's got to teach a sound message.
Going back to your argument, I mean, I love it. I think it's beautiful, logical, elegant, sophisticated. But isn't that also the weakness of it? Isn't the sophistication of it? Isn't it difficult for people, and even in the public debate today, and the type of public debates we can have, isn't it just too complex, too difficult? And I mean, the result, I mean, you were involved in the public debate in the US before the Dobbs decision, and clearly, I mean, in some sense, right, the argument failed. It didn't succeed. So isn't there a better way to kind of go about this?
Well, the argument's got to be made at all sorts of different levels. I made it here at the philosophical level because I was assuming I have an audience here that knows how to follow a philosophical argument. If I were making this argument in a middle school, children 11, 12 years old, I would have given a different lecture. Maybe you would have liked that lecture better than this one. But you have to pitch your argument at the level of your audience. And so an argument for the general public, when I was advocating in the United States, for example, when I was doing television appearances or something like that, I didn't make the kind of argument that you just heard. But it is important. Well, let me put it to you this way. It's not important that the average man or woman, the normal person, the working person, is able to make the argument I made or even understand it completely. It is important that they know someone can make it. It is important that they know someone who can answer the person who says to them, "Oh, Mr. Worker, if you don't go along with us and embrace our idea of redefining marriage, you are a bigot." He doesn't want to be a bigot. He doesn't want to be a bad person. He doesn't want to be a homophobe. He doesn't want to be a racist. And he asks himself, am I those things? Am I a bigot? He can answer that question, no, I'm not a bigot, if he knows that someone like me or you or others in this audience can make the argument. He doesn't have to be able to make it himself. I mean, look, people on the other side can't make the sophisticated argument for same-sex marriage. You know, they can say, you're a bigot if you don't agree with me. That's not a sophisticated argument. So, you know. But
still, they won. I mean, still, hasn't the culture...
Well, they in the United States, they only won because they persuaded 5 people to vote their way.
But you would,
that's the Supreme Court. I mean, notice, by the way...
Public opinion has changed too, right, on this issue?
Only after the... What did I say law was, Martin?
Teacher. Yeah,
a teacher. And what happened when the law changed? We went from 60-40 against redefining marriage to 60-40 in favor of redefining marriage. From the beginning, the campaign to redefine marriage was much more popular among elites than among ordinary people. And what I was making was the argument to show ordinary people that their instincts, their common sense was defensible, that they were not bigots and racists, because they were not bigots.
So you still believe that rational arguments actually can make a difference, and there are people who listen to them?
They do, but I mean, you have to take the measure of the problem. I mean, we're up against a situation, and it's not just with respect to same-sex marriage. It's with respect to polyamory. It's with respect to abortion, euthanasia, drug legalization and drug use, all sorts of things like that, where elites are in one place and ordinary people are in another place. Now, we are seeing in the United States, and I believe that you are now seeing in Europe, a rebellion against elites. Am I right that you're seeing this here? We are certainly seeing it in the United States. This is what the Trump phenomenon is all about. It's a rebellion against elites. Let me tell you how Donald Trump got elected president of the United States and how he might get elected again in November. It was really one proposition captures it all. He said to ordinary Americans, he means the elites, they say they are out to get me. They're not out to get me. They're out to get you, and I am in their way. And that resonated with people because it's true that our elites in the United States have contempt for ordinary people, especially religious people. Catholics, evangelical Protestants, Orthodox Jews, they have contempt for their values. They have contempt for their way of life, for their beliefs, for their culture. And this has provoked a rebellion. And who knows where that's going to go? It could go to some dark places. I am not enthusiastic about the populist revolt. There are some things on which I think they are right, but I worry that it could go to some dark places. So at least I think people like me need to play a role in making sure that things don't here go off the rails. The elites are guilty of what people like Trump accuse them of. But there are some places where people like Trump want to take them that I don't think would be good to go.
I think we're running out of time, but whoa, there are many questions in the audience. Okay, Samuel.
Thank you, Professor George, for your lecture. I very much enjoyed it. I read the book, What is Marriage? I think 10 years ago. I took part in one of the summer seminars in Princeton. And during my time as a student at universities in Great Britain, and then in my career here as political assistant working in the parliament, the argument was very helpful throughout in my work and in my just conversations with my friends. So I want to thank you for that, first of all. But my question is briefly about the Obergefell case. Recently, the Supreme Court of the United States has overturned the verdict which basically said Roe v. Wade that abortion basically has to be protected by the Constitution. Recently, the Obergefell v. Hodge decision said that gay marriage is a federal right in a way, and the states on the state level cannot ban it. So my question to you is, what is your political estimation whether Obergefell, now with the majority of Republican justices on the Supreme Court, whether it could and might be and will be overturned in the near future? Thank you.
Yes, I think if we could get a case up to the Supreme Court, it would attract at least 5 votes, probably 6 to overturn.
Will that happen anytime soon, do you think? Or?
I think it will happen in the next 10 years. I don't think it'll happen in the next 2 years. Exactly how long between those two time extents, I'm not sure, but it will take a while. I mean, one problem is the one that Martin put his finger on, or mentioned, that public opinion has changed. I mean, the Supreme Court ruling had a profound effect on public opinion, and elites do control education, journalism, entertainment, the philanthropic foundations, and many of the big corporations, the big businesses, have embraced the whole, they call it pride agenda. And this makes it very difficult to actually get laws made in the states that would enable us to get a case before the Supreme Court because of the Supreme Court's what are called standing requirements. You need a certain, you need to have an actual law before the court with people who are affected by the law bringing the case in order for the court to judge that there's a litigant with standing to bring the case. So it will take a while. But the Supreme Court is in a very different place right now than it was in 2017. That's how you got the reversal of the abortion decision, Roe against Wade. So I think the prospects there are good.
We are running out of time, so I have to ask. I'll ask the last question, and it will be one of those, but I'll phrase it, and it's a little personal. It's asking for marriage advice. There are young people out there who want to get married, some soon, some later. You've been married for a long time, I imagine. What would be
42 years, 42
congratulations.
beautiful years.
So what would be your
very tolerant woman, very tolerant.
how should they choose their partner? What should they do to have a successful marriage of 42 years?
Well, I'll tell a little story. Every year at Princeton University, my university where I teach, 3 or 4 professors are invited to give what are called last lectures. Last lectures. It's a lecture to the graduating students, and they invite professors who are well known outside of Princeton, but where a particular student, maybe because of his field, has not had an opportunity to study with this professor. So it's an opportunity to hear this professor. So from time to time, I'm invited to give one of the last lectures, and the last one I gave, which was a couple of years ago. They had all we call them seniors. They would be 21 years old, 22 years old. And then they were sitting there, maybe 1,000. And then there were all the deans and other professors who were sitting in the front rows, older people, you know, my generation, your generation, and so forth. So I said, I'm not going to give you a lecture today, as I have in the past when I've given these lectures, on my field. I'm not going to give you a lecture on constitutional law. I'm not going to give you a lecture on moral philosophy or political philosophy or civil liberties. I'm not going to give you a lecture in my fields of expertise. I'm going to give you a lecture about how I think you should live your lives. And I certainly want to say I think you should live your lives with integrity. I think you should continue and not just think your education ends today. You should be lifelong learners. You should be, as I said in my opening remarks here the other day, you should be determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers. You should be bold in standing up for what you believe in. But you should also be intellectually humble and willing to engage criticism and recognize your own fallibility and recognize that you could be wrong. So far, everyone's fine. Then I said, and you should get married. And you should not wait to get married. You should get married when you're younger, in your mid-20s, not wait until your late 30s. And you should have lots of children. The students are all fine. They're smiling. They're nodding their heads. The faculty and the deans were in shock. They'd never heard such outrageous, scandalous statements from a fellow professor. But it's good advice. Our young people today are waiting too long to get married. It's especially a challenge for the young women, of course, because the biological clock ticks. If you're marrying when you're 35, 36, 37, your fertility becomes an issue. How many children you can have now is an issue. So I encourage my students, I'm not saying like in the old days, get married at 19 or 17, but don't wait to 35, 36, get married. And there is nothing I can tell you more important in life, more beautiful, more wonderful than your children. You know, Martin, that I've been a very fortunate man. I've been showered with honors and recognitions and all this. I would give them all away tomorrow to have one more child. One more child. It's because children are the most beautiful thing. I now have grandchildren. That's even better. It's everything it's cracked up to be. For those of you who are not yet grandparents, they're not exaggerating when they say how wonderful it is to be grandparents. But when you're young and you're focused on your career and your social status and making your way in the world and being someone important and all that, you can lose the focus on the most important thing, your relationship with your spouse and the beautiful gift of children that come to you. So you know, don't wait. You don't get a second chance. You don't get to go back and be 25 when you're 37. So find a person, find a good person, look for those qualities of integrity, virtue. Those are much more important than physical beauty or anything like that. Make sure that you have a sharing of some interests, but not too much, because you need to be different too. To be complementary, you need to be different. You have your own lives, but you integrate yourselves. And when you marry at least a little bit younger, maybe in your mid-20s, you have some time to grow together. If you wait until you're 37, 38, 39, you don't have time where you're growing together. Your marriage is a merger. It's like Apple and Google decide to merge. Take some time when you're growing together. It's very much worth it. That's my advice.
Thank you very much. I was told we still have, let's see. This works better for the Slovak audience than philosophical arguments. Experience, life, emotions. But we still have couple more minutes. Robo, I was told by the boss, couple more minutes, right? Okay. Doesn't work.
Okay, it's working. Thank you, Professor George, for another brilliant lecture. Although I completely agree with everything, basically, you have told us today, I'm a little bit puzzled about one particular thing. You said that that in order for people to properly recognize what marriage is about, they need a culture around them which will communicate the basic good of marriage and properly communicate it. And I'm wondering if the urge to procreation is one of the most strongest biological urges, and at the same time we are rational beings who know that we need to do it properly in a lifelong relationship and all the other conditions. Why is marriage? Why is it so hard for us to properly understand marriage and to lead a proper life if this is one of the most fundamental things which should be written in natural law, and we should be able to grasp it even if the state or culture around us is not so much in support of it? Thank you.
I think the answer, Robert, is wayward emotion. We can easily be led astray by feeling. I said in my opening remarks here when I arrived on the first night, was that the first night for the overall festival? I remember that I said the historians break up the ages, the epochs, into the age of this, age of that, medieval period, age of faith, Enlightenment, age of reason. If the medieval period's age of faith, Enlightenment's the age of reason, what do we live in? We live in the age of feeling. And that is because we've eliminated the idea that reason can and should constrain feeling. And reason has to constrain feeling because our feelings, our emotions, our desires will lead us astray. Not every time, but they need to be ordered. I'm not arguing for Buddhism. I have great respect for Buddhism. I've studied Buddhism. I had a great teacher, a Buddhist monk who was a great teacher. But I'm not arguing for the extinguishment of desire, the extinguishment of feeling or emotion on the at least what I was taught as the Theravada tradition of Buddhism. I'm not even arguing for Stoicism. I think that emotion is a good thing in itself if it's properly ordered and properly directed, and that means it's got to be brought under the sway of reason. So it needs to be under the discipline of reason. But there we cannot do that just individually. You need to be formed to exercise reason, beginning with the family, assisted by the church and other institutions of civil society. The law itself then is a teacher. Culture teaches and shapes us. And all of these institutions will do their jobs in helping us to order our lives with reason and control of passion, either better or worse. The family will either do a good job or a bad job. The law will either do a good job or a bad job. There's no middle position. And that's why we need law to be right, and why we need culture to do its job. We need the institutions of civil society, including the church, to do their job. We're not just born rational. We have to be taught. We're taught a language. We're taught our reasoning skills. Now, unless we had a rational nature, it would be impossible to teach us those things. You cannot teach a cat how to reason logically, because a cat lacks a rational nature. But just having the rational nature itself, even the law written on the heart, which is what St. Paul refers to in the letter to the Romans, is ineffective unless we are tutored, unless we are taught to be reasoned and reasoning creatures. Is that responsive to your question? Yeah. If it is, can I go back to an earlier question, your question about divorce, because there's something that I learned that maybe other people know, but if you don't know, I think this is so fascinating. Everybody knows that divorce has very bad consequences for minor children. By minor children, I mean children who are still at home in their parents' care. Technically, in the United States, minority is anyone under 18 years old. Okay. But a lot of people thought, and I, until I learned this about this study, was inclined to think that divorce would not be such an issue, at least for children, if parents divorce when the children are grown up, they're out of the house, maybe they're at university, maybe they're beyond university, maybe they're married, maybe they have children of their own. But then a woman, a sociologist in the United States named Elizabeth Marquardt, did a study, and she did a study for very personal reasons. She was a 40-year-old woman. She was married. She had children of her own. She was in a happy marriage. She had children. She was having a good life. She was a professor or sociologist, a scholar. And her parents got divorced. And she found herself devastated, absolutely devastated. And she said to herself, why am I devastated? I mean, I'm a grown-up. I've got a family of my own. My mom and dad, my parents are not getting along. They get divorced. They're going their separate ways. Why do I care? But I care. This prompted her to do a study of adult children of divorce. And what she found was remarkable. Everything we believed was wrong. Adult children are every bit as invested in their parents' marriages as young children are. It is just as devastating to adult children of divorce as minor children of divorce. Tells us something about ourselves. Tells us something about who we are. We really are invested for the whole of our lives in our parents' marriages. Marital relations matter. They really matter, and not just to the couple.
Thank you. This really was the last question. We have to finish. And all I can say at the end is that it was truly a privilege for me to be sitting here with you tonight. Two worlds joined for me. In some sense, the U.S. and the U.S. experience lies behind the whole project of the Hanus Fellowship, and the inspiration that your work and work of many others in the U.S. Still continues to influence us. And we thank you for that, and thank you for coming again and for being with us tonight. And of course, these were not the last words of Professor George. I think he'll continue tonight with another event, and there will be a lecture at the law faculty on Monday. So we can still enjoy your presence here. So thank you very much. A myslím, že ide hudba, alebo nejde hudba?
Ja chcem ešte raz veľmi pekne poďakovať našim hosťom aj nášmu pánovi moderátorovi Martinovi Lutherovi, takže veľký potlesk. Luteránovi, pardon. No a ďakujeme aj našim partnerom a podporovateľom. A zároveň by som vás chcela veľmi tak povzbudiť k jednej veci. Na dofinancovanie celého tohto festivalu aj tento rok usporiadávame zbierku vo výške 12 000 eur a aktuálny stav zbierky je 8 152 eur, takže nám chýba ešte 3 848 eur, aby sme mohli pokryť fungovanie celého tohto festivalu. Takže ak sa vám festival páči a vidíte zmysel v tom, čo robíme, tak nám môžete pomôcť svojim darom buď 5, 10 alebo 30 eurami. A môžete tak urobiť prostredníctvom portálu Donácia.sk. A tu sa vám zobrazil aj QR kód, ktorý si môžete naskenovať. Vidíte ho teraz za mnou. No a dnes vás ešte srdečne pozývam na diskusiu svetových kresťanských intelektuálov o budúcnosti Európy, ktorá sa odohrá tu v záhrade teraz o 20:00. No a v rovnakom čase začne v priestoroch Galérie Statua prednáška dominikána Ireneja Maroša Fintora o láske neskutočnej. A taktiež v rámci Janusových dní začne o 21:00 hodine v kapucínskom kostole BHD Light. To je večerná adorácia, ten kostol je tuto oproti. A po jej skončení budeme sláviť vigíliu svätej omše o 22:30 a hlavným celebrantom bude dominikán Filip Neri Ries. No a počas celého festivalu prebieha aj umelecká výstava mladého slovenského umelca Samuela Riníka s názvom Boj o cnosť. A počas prestávok, napríklad aj teraz, sa tam môžete ísť pozrieť do galérie, prebieha v galérii Statua. No a taktiež spoločenstvo Ladislava Hanusa vás pozýva na letnú tomistickú školu organizovanú rádom Dominikánov, kde môžete prežiť 6 dní v intelektuálno-komunitno-duchovnom prostredí na tému filozofia lásky. A pre viac informácií môžete navštíviť stránku tic.dominikani.sk. A ešte tu máme takú špeciálnu pozvánku na divadelné predstavenie, ktoré nám povie naša pani režisérka Rebeka Lukáčová.
Ďakujem pekne. Mám tu aj jednu z hlavných herečiek, takže Mária bude tiež v tomto projekte. Budúci víkend chystáme autorské divadelné predstavenie, ktoré bude súčasťou bratislavských Hanusových dní. Bude o Svetom Františkovi z Assisi, takže všetci ste srdečne pozvaní. 22. a 23.6. o 19.00 v Teatro Colorato. Lístky a viac informácií môžete nájsť na hanusovedni.sk. Takže verím, že sa tam uvidíme. Ďakujem.
Verím aj ja. No a ešte posledná taká praktická vec, vás chcem poprosiť, aby ste vrátili do stanice tieto vaše sluchadlá, pretože včera sa 2 stratili niekde, takže ich môžete potom odovzdať po závere. No a teraz vás už chcem pozvať na našu Hanusovú terasu, kde si môžete užiť kávu, občerstvenie, sú tam aj nejaké knihy. Najhorúcejšia novinka je kniha od Scotta Hanna, Katolíci vo vyhnanstve, a je to o biblickej múdrosti na cestu domov do nebeskej vlasti, a tiež nové číslo časopisu pre kresťanskú kultúru Verbum, venované novej kresťanskej generácii, takže vlastne nám. No a okrem toho všetkého tam môžete aj kúpiť kávu, liberálnu a konzervatívnu. Takže okrem toho, že vyjadríte aj svoj názor, sa aj zapojíte do súťaže, ktorá káva sa vypredá skôr. Bola som sa pýtať, momentálne je stav 4:4, takže neváhajte a choďte sa zapojiť. Bude to aj ako merch pre Hanusové dni, takže nás tým aj podporíte. No a to je z mojej strany všetko. Prajem vám ešte pekný večer a vidíme sa na ďalšom programe.